I learned in my own house that grief could be audited like an expense report, line by line with no allowance for memory, and that my silence was interpreted as proof I had nothing worth defending. My name is Taylor Sullivan, and the night my father's medals vanished, I stopped waiting to be believed. The regimental hall carried the same scent it had carried when I was 9, and sitting with my shoes dangling above a waxed floor, brass polish, old wood varnish, coffee gone dark on a warming tray, wool uniforms that held rain long after men came in from parking lots. The overhead lights reflected off framed campaign photographs in disciplined rows, each frame aligned to the same height, each label in the same serif font, each life reduced to date ranges and theatre names. At the centre aisle, the honour table stood beneath 2 flags and a shallow arrangement of white lilies. To the left of the dais, where my father's memorial display should have held its full weight, a velvet-lined case sat closed, dignified, and lighter than truth. That morning, I had opened the same case in the study at home and found empty recesses where metal should have caught light. I had touched each hollow shape with 2 fingers, as if confirmation required tactile evidence. The starburst cutout where his silver star had rested was vacant. The circular depression for the campaign set was vacant. The pin channels for unit commendations were vacant. I checked the lower drawer, then the document cabinet, then the locked trunk in the storage room, because procedure had always steadied me, and because panic without structure had never solved anything. No transfer note, no signed inventory adjustment, no board authorization. When I asked Vanessa Cade whether she had moved the medals for preservation, she did not answer the question. She asked whether I was spiralling again, then reminded me we had guests expected by 1800. By 1910, the memorial dinner had filled to capacity. Senior officers occupied the central tables near the podium, trustees and donors were staged 1 ring out, and family support sat at the perimeter, close enough to be photographed, far enough to be managed. A captain I recognized from procurement nodded politely as he passed, then angled his body toward Vanessa before he reached my row. I watched this choreography with the clinical patience my father taught me when a convoy route became contested. Observe the pattern before attempting correction. Who was centered? Who was named? Who was thanked? Who was omitted? The hall did not run on affection. It ran on acknowledgement. Vanessa stood when the announcer called for stewardship remarks. She wore black silk, conservative neckline, my father's regimental widow pin at her left shoulder, and a diamond bracelet that caught each stage light like punctuation. She raised a crystal glass and waited for the room's ambient sound to settle. She had practiced this kind of pause for years. "Tonight," she said, "we honour Colonel Daniel Sullivan not only for service rendered, but for legacy protected." She smiled toward the officers' table. Let the officers handle legacy matters. Taylor was always sentimental, never strategic. Laughter followed, not loud, not cruel in tone, but sufficient, the kind that signals consent while preserving deniability. I did not move. I did not stand. I did not reach for the side microphone mounted between tables. The old instinct to defend him with every detail I carried, blood type engravings, deployment dates, inventory codes, the way he wrapped each medal in lint-free cloth after ceremonies, rose hard and immediate, then settled under discipline. Outbursts become anecdotes. Documentation becomes record. My father had repeated that line across my adolescence with the unromantic rigour of a logistics officer who knew emotion could cloud a manifest. Vanessa continued with the practiced rhythm of someone who had discovered that tone can substitute for evidence if the audience wants convenience. She introduced donated memorabilia from the Sullivan Archive, presenting campaign maps and a field journal that had not been in the original catalogue, speaking as though custodianship were a birthright bestowed by confidence rather than a role governed by chain of custody. She thanked trustees by surname and rank. She thanked sponsors by company name. She thanked friends who protected this family during difficult months. She did not say my name again. At the side screen, a slideshow advanced through images I had not approved, captions rewritten to foreground her as the Colonel's true steward. In one photo, I stood at my father's retirement ceremony at the edge of the frame, my shoulder visible and unlabelled, while her caption read, "Preserving his standards, even in loss." The edge table where I sat was set with polished silver and folded cards, but no one from the board took that row. A junior trustee briefly approached, glanced at my place card, then redirected towards central seating after Vanessa made eye contact across the room. Beside my plate sat the printed programme. heavy paper stock, embossed crest. Under legacy custody acknowledgements, the name listed was Vanessa Cade, Sole Steward. My own designation appeared 3 pages later in smaller text beneath volunteer logistics, family liaison, non-voting. The room's social temperature was precise, and I had lived inside this precision before. Years earlier, when I entered military logistics, Vanessa described my role at receptions as administrative support, with that faint, polished pity reserved for work people rely on while pretending not to see it. When remembrance speeches were assigned, she argued I was too emotional for public remarks, then used my absence at the podium as evidence I could not handle pressure. When local papers asked for family comment, she submitted statements before I saw draft copies. Every single slight could be dismissed as minor, explainable, accidental. In aggregate, it functioned as governance: diminish, redefine, repeat. A server placed roasted chicken in front of me and asked if I needed anything else. I thanked him and said, no. Across the hall, Vanessa tilted her glass toward a retired brigadier and accepted applause as if inheritance and credibility were interchangeable assets. At my table, 2 spouses discussed scholarship quotas in low tones and avoided looking directly at me. The cutlery reflected the ceiling lights in narrow, steady lines. I inhaled, held, and let breath leave at a measured count, the same protocol I used during instant reviews when a room was searching for a weak response to validate an existing conclusion. Halfway through dessert service, the announcer invited attendees to examine the memorial displays after the closing hymn. I knew what they would find in my father's case: perfect velvet geometry and absence. I also knew what they would not find: any transfer authorization bearing my signature as designated archival reviewer under his last signed inventory amendment. Vanessa had spoken all evening in nouns that sounded final: legacy, stewardship, family, trust. But nouns are not custody. Custody is timestamps, signatures, controlled access, witnessable movement. Custody is the difference between reverence and theft wearing formal clothing. When the final toast ended, chairs shifted against the waxed floor in soft, synchronized pulls. Officers rose first, then trustees, then guests, hierarchy even in departure. I remained seated long enough to avoid entering the same aisle as Vanessa. As people moved toward the displays, she descended from the stage and accepted condolences, with her head inclined at exactly the right angle. Grief curated for public utility. For a moment, her gaze crossed mine, and she offered a small smile that did not contain warmth. It contained assessment. She was measuring whether I would challenge her in public, whether I would hand her a scene she could frame as instability by morning. I gave her nothing. I stood, smoothed the front of my dress uniform, and walked toward the rear corridor where the hall's framed commendations gave way to uncarpeted service access and fluorescent hum. A bulletin board there held outdated training notices and a map of emergency exits. I placed my hand against the cool cinder-block wall and let the pressure in my chest settle into language I could carry forward. This was not about inheritance theatre, not about who held the microphone, not about whether her version of our family sounded cleaner to donors. This was chain of custody truth, and truth had institutions of its own. If Vanessa chose audience perception as her weapon, I would answer in rooms built for verification. Records office counters, probate dockets, evidence review tables, halls where rank recognized documentation over performance. In the reflection of a darkened service window, I saw my own posture return to center. Shoulders squared, jaw unclenched, expression neutral enough to survive cross-examination. The wound did not shrink because I named it. It sharpened. It became usable. I had spent months confusing restraint with peace. That night, under fluorescent light and military seals, I understood the cost of that error with a clarity that felt almost ceremonial. Silence was not peace. It was surrender. I was done surrendering. I pushed away from the cinder block and returned through the service door just as the crowd thickened around the memorial displays, the hum of low conversation layered over silverware being cleared and the closing notes of the hymn still hanging faintly above the room. From the rear aisle, I could see the hierarchy reassemble itself in smaller circles. Senior officers nearest the honour table, trustees half a step back, local press and donors leaning in where photographs were being taken. My father's case sat beneath a narrow cone of light, velvet interior exposed now, and the emptiness I had found at dawn was no longer private. People were studying the hollow shapes with polite curiosity, as though the missing weight were part of a curated design decision. Vanessa arrived at the display before I did and laid 2 fingers on the case edge with proprietary calm. A trustee asked quietly, but not quietly enough, whether the campaign set had been moved for restoration. Vanessa did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, carrying her voice just far enough for the nearest semicircle to hear. "Conservation review. We are protecting Colonel Sullivan's legacy from unmanaged handling." Then she turned her head toward me, the movement slight and deliberate. "Taylor has had a difficult season. Please route archival questions through me tonight." The sentence landed with the polished softness of protocol, and several people nodded as if relieved to be given social instructions. One donor's wife gave me an expression reserved for convalescence and stepped half a pace away from the case. I reached the outer edge of the group and stopped where the light from the display met the shadow from the aisle. The brass rail was cool under my hand. An old major I knew from my father's retirement ceremony glanced at the empty recesses, then at me, then back to Vanessa, and chose convenience. "Prudent," he said to her. "These things need proper stewardship." Vanessa accepted that endorsement with a modest incline of her head. "Exactly." She angled her body to block my direct line to the placard and spoke to the cluster behind her. "There's been some sentimental confusion in the family. We are correcting that with professional process." Someone laughed softly, not maliciously, merely eager to align with the prevailing account. The sound pressed against my ribs harder than a shout would have. The announcer called for a foundation photograph at the honour table, and staff began gathering named participants. I heard names from central seating, surnames and ranks pronounced with care, then a pause, then Vanessa's voice from near the dais. "Family principles first, please." When I stepped forward on reflex, a volunteer coordinator intercepted me with a clipboard and apologetic eyes. "Ms. Sullivan, we have you on support row placement for this shot." She pointed toward the perimeter where spouses had been standing minutes earlier. The correction was procedural, almost kind. That made it worse. I moved where she indicated, far enough from the table that the white lilies cut me out of the composition. Flashbulbs fired. People adjusted posture. Vanessa stood at centre, holding the widow pin line straight on her shoulder, and in every frame the empty display case sat 3 feet to her right like a controlled absence. Between shots, she looked over and said, lightly, "You understand, Taylor. This is a governance image." Then, for the nearest officers, "We cannot have grief dictating archival policy." One of the trustees gave a brief, approving murmur. Another asked whether the Foundation should issue a clarifying statement about custodianship. Vanessa answered, "I am already handling it." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She had audience momentum and the confidence that comes from never being contradicted in the same room twice. A few guests drifted toward me after the photos, not to ask what had happened, but to offer advice in the form of condolences. "Take care of yourself," one woman said, touching my sleeve with 2 fingers. "Legal matters can become overwhelming." A retired colonel I had known since childhood told me, "Your father valued composure. Keep your focus." He meant well. He also meant stay quiet. I thanked them both because politeness is the language people use when they are choosing distance. Across the hall, Vanessa was already in conversation with a local paper editor, chin lifted, one hand resting near the case like a curator beside a sanctioned collection. Every signal said, "settled." Every signal said, I was the unstable variable. She crossed to me when the crowd thinned near the dessert station, carrying an empty crystal glass and a smile that looked almost maternal from 10 feet away. Up close, it held no softness. "Do not force me to protect your reputation from you," she said, low and precise. "If you create a scene over items removed for care, I will have to explain your condition in formal terms." I kept my hands at my sides. She continued before I answered, "You were always disciplined at following instructions, Taylor. Follow this one." Then she stepped back, replaced the public expression, and turned toward a waiting pair of trustees. I stood where she had left me, hearing the cutlery bins being stacked in the service corridor and the scrape of chairs as the room reset for departure. I did not answer her in the aisle. I did not answer her at the case. I walked instead to the side table where printed programs were stacked for guests who had arrived late, took one clean copy, and set it beside my own on a narrow ledge under a wall sconce. The hall's clock overcoat check read 21:37. I opened my phone camera, photographed the program page listing Vanessa as sole steward, then turned and photographed my father's display from 3 angles: full case, placard, and close framing of the empty velvet recesses under overhead light. I included the wall clock in one frame and the evening's date card in another. Procedure steadied my breathing faster than anger ever had. A facilities sergeant was locking the rear cabinet of extension cords near the dais. I approached, identified myself, and asked for a condition notation in the event log for display table C at 2140, witnessed by on-duty staff. He hesitated, glanced toward Vanessa, then back to me. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" he asked. "There is a discrepancy in archived property presentation," I said. "I am requesting neutral documentation, not a judgment." He held my gaze for a second, then nodded once and wrote in his logbook. I asked him to initial the entry and permit a photograph of the page. He did. I thanked him and stepped away before anyone could reinterpret the exchange as confrontation. Near the exit, I drafted a short email to the Memorial Foundation's records administrator, copied board counsel and the regimental archivist, and attached 4 images with file names I could search later without ambiguity. Subject line: Immediate preservation notice. Sullivan medal display discrepancy. In the body, I used institutional language my father would have approved. Observed condition, location, time, no conclusions asserted, request for hold on transfer or disposal pending chain of custody verification. I did not accuse Vanessa by name in that first notice. I did not need to. The point was to create a time-stamped record that existed outside her voice. I read it twice, removed one adjective, and sent it. When I looked up, Vanessa was 20 feet away speaking with the paper editor and 2 donors under the regimental crest. She saw the phone in my hand and gave a small, incredulous shake of her head as if I had failed a test she expected me to pass. Then she raised her voice half a register for the listeners around her. "Families in mourning often confuse access with authority," she said. "We have to protect institutions from emotional volatility." The editor wrote that line down. I felt the impact as a physical thing, like stepping into crosswind on a tarmac, not enough to knock me over, enough to force a correction. I put my phone away and kept walking at the same pace toward the service corridor. In the corridor, fluorescent light flattened every colour to utility tones. I braced one hand on the metal shelf where spare programs were stored and let the first surge of anger pass through without granting it command. My father had taught me inventory discipline when I was 12 by making me recite steps until they became reflex. Identify asset, verify condition, record movement, secure witness, escalate through proper channel. Grief had tried to turn those steps into sentiment for months. Tonight they returned as structure. I took out a legal pad from my satchel and wrote 5 names in order of proximity to the display when Vanessa made her conservation claim, plus the exact wording I could quote without embellishment. Not because memory fails, but because memory is always attacked first. By 21:52, most guests had moved into the parking lot, their voices muffled through the heavy doors. I returned to the main hall one last time, waited until the area around my father's case cleared, and checked the placard bracket. The screw on the right side was newly stripped, silver bright against older patina. A small mechanical detail that did not fit the Foundation's usual careful handling. I photographed it, then photographed the underside of the case where transport tape residue clung in 2 parallel strips. Distinctive details mattered later when broad claims collapsed into specifics. When I straightened, I caught my reflection in the glass. Uniform immaculate, expression controlled, eyes more alert than exhausted. At the exit, the volunteer coordinator from earlier handed me my coat and said, almost whispering, "I am sorry about the seating confusion." I met her gaze and answered with the calm I had been guarding all evening. It was not confusion, but thank you. Outside, the air was cold enough to sharpen breath, and the flag over the hall moved in measured folds against a dark sky. I stood by my car long enough to forward my preservation notice to my personal archive account and print queue, then called the after-hours clerk for probate records and left a concise request for first available filing guidance at opening. No argument, no accusation, just the framework. When I ended the call, I sat in the driver's seat, placed the legal pad on the passenger side, and looked back at the lit windows of the hall where my father's name had been used as a credential by people who assumed I would keep absorbing the cost. I had chosen silence in the room where she wanted spectacle, not because I was weak, and not because I accepted her version, but because the first record entered in anger is often the easiest to discredit. Tonight, I had no outburst to apologise for and no loose claim to retract. I had timestamps, images, witness initials, and language built for review. Vanessa still held the microphone. I had started building the file that would take it away. I kept my hands on the steering wheel until the tremor in my fingers settled, then turned the key and let the engine idle while the hall lights held steady in the rearview mirror. My phone vibrated once on the console with an automated response from the Foundation Records office confirming receipt of my preservation notice and assigning a reference number. The message was bland, procedural, and exactly what I needed. A file existed now outside Vanessa's reach. I read the reference number twice, repeated it aloud, and drove home through streets still wet from evening rain, each traffic signal reflecting in broken red and gold across the windshield. The house was dark except for the study lamp she had left on, a warm pool of light arranged for appearances rather than use. I locked the front door, set my coat over the banister, and walked straight to the display cabinet, where my father had kept the medals in archival sleeves. The velvet recesses looked theatrical under the lamp, a stage set for absence. I opened my satchel at the dining table and laid out the evening's record in sequence. Printed program, photographs, event log image, copy of my email. My father had taught me that sequence was not a habit but a defense against reinterpretation. Facts without order become opinion. As I slid each page into a temporary evidence folder, memory moved in with the discipline of a drill instructor, not a wave. I was 24 again at the Logistics Command briefing, where I had presented a supply chain correction that prevented a winter fuel delay across 2 training sites. I had prepared for 3 nights, cross-checked every number, and answered 30 minutes of questions from officers who tested assumptions as if uncertainty were a personal failing. My recommendation was adopted. 2 days later, at a donor reception, Vanessa stood beside me in front of a polished model of a transport aircraft and introduced me to a trustee as Daniel's daughter. Very organised, she handles administrative details. I had looked at her, then at the trustee and said, I oversee transport allocation and depot reconciliation. The trustee smiled politely and turned back to Vanessa. You must be proud she has your steadiness, he told her. She accepted the compliment as though competence were a trait she had lent me. The pattern deepened after my father's first cardiac episode, when sympathy gave Vanessa a kind of social immunity. At planning meetings for remembrance events, I would arrive with draft run-of-show documents and custody notes, and she would wait until the room settled before saying, Taylor, perhaps this is too close to home for you. We can have someone else speak. If I stayed silent, that silence became evidence of fragility. If I objected, objection became proof of instability. Once, in the officers' lounge before a memorial scholarship announcement, I asked why my prepared remarks had been removed from the agenda. Vanessa straightened a stack of programs and said, in front of 2 board members, because this evening requires strategic tone, not personal catharsis. One board member avoided my eyes, the other touched my arm and said I should rest. I watched my own name disappear from the podium card 10 minutes later. By late spring that year, she had started rewriting captions on the Foundation archive site. Small edits that looked harmless unless you had lived inside the original photographs. A retirement ceremony image of my father pinning my logistics insignia became Vanessa Cade supporting Colonel Sullivan's family through transition. A Field Family Day picture where I stood beside a transport manifest board became Operational Spouse Volunteers Assisting Command Logistics. I submitted correction requests through formal channels, each one with dates, source files, and witness names. The replies always thanked me for my passion and promised review. Nothing changed. A narrative can be engineered by cutting labels, not just by inventing events. The worst evening had come 6 months before his death, when he asked me to bring the medal case to the dining room so he could verify the inventory against his handwritten list. His hands were slower then, but still exact. He wore reading glasses low on his nose and touched each medal with the same 2-finger method he had used when teaching me preservation standards. Vanessa entered halfway through, carrying a ledger and 2 envelopes. Daniel, this obsession with hardware is exhausting everyone, she said. Then she looked at me and added, Taylor, if you invested this energy in healing, we might all breathe. My father did not raise his voice. He rarely did. He only said, inventory is healing. She smiled without agreeing. Later that night, I found the envelopes on the kitchen counter, labelled with expense categories for funeral planning she had begun before his specialist review was complete. Grief, itemised in advance. I set my pen down and pressed my thumb into the edge of the table until sensation returned to my hands. My mind kept moving through those years in clean cuts, each one connected to the next by the same logic. Diminish, frame, repeat. She had not tried to overpower me with rage. She had narrowed me with etiquette. She had learned that in military and civic rooms, a woman who stayed composed could still be dismissed if someone else controlled the interpretation of her composure. Silence was recast as inability, discipline recast as detachment, precision recast as obsession. She never needed a dramatic lie when a sequence of minor distortions would do. At 0:43, I printed duplicate copies of everything and sealed one set in a fireproof pouch. I placed the pouch in the lower safe with my father's inventory amendment and his last signed custodial note naming me archival reviewer. Then I opened a notebook to a clean page and wrote a heading in block letters. Pattern evidence. Public invalidation events. I listed dates, locations, witness names, exact statements. No adjectives, no speculation, just the trail. Outside, a truck passed and rattled the kitchen window for a second, then the house settled again into its old wood quiet. When I finally sat on the sofa, shoes still on, dawn was beginning to flatten the sky at the edge of the curtains. The probate clerk returned my after-hours call at 8:12 with a clipped professional voice and gave me the filing window for an injunction request tied to disputed estate property. She could not offer advice, but she confirmed one fact that mattered. No transfer authorization for military memorabilia had been filed with the court since my father's death. If items were sold, counsel will ask for chain of custody proof, she said. Bring timestamps and comparative identifiers. I thanked her, wrote her full name and extension in my contact log, and asked permission to cite that procedural instruction in my filing note. She granted it. An external contact logged and anchored. By the second Saturday after the memorial dinner, I had reviewed every local resale listing I could access and driven to 3 weekend markets where military surplus sometimes changed hands without scrutiny. The first 2 yielded nothing beyond mismatched ribbons and reproduction pins. The third market sat under a corrugated roof on the edge of the county fairgrounds, with fluorescent tubes buzzing overhead and concrete floors marked by old tape lines. Vendors spoke in low bargaining voices over folding tables stacked with tools, vinyl records, decommissioned radios, and crates of insignia that smelled faintly of machine oil and cardboard dust. I walked each aisle with printed reference photos in a document sleeve, stopping at stalls where older campaign sets were displayed without provenance. At stall 47, I saw a rectangular patch of cleaner concrete near the rear table where a heavy case had recently stood, and on the table edge a strip of green paint transfer that matched the lockbox my father used for off-site presentations. The vendor there, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair pinned under a navy scarf and reading glasses on a beaded cord, watched me study the paint mark. Her badge read, Inez Calder. She did not greet me with sales patter. She said, "You're looking for something that should not have come through this aisle." The sentence landed with the weight of recognition, not curiosity. I answered carefully. I am tracking protected military property removed from a private display without authorized transfer. I showed her my father's medal case photograph, then my own ID and the Foundation Preservation Notice reference. Her expression did not soften, but it settled into decision. "Wait here," she said. She stepped behind a hanging tarp into a storage nook and returned with a legal envelope and a slim USB drive wrapped in a receipt stub. I kept copies because the seller insisted on cash split into separate entries and refused item descriptions beyond old pins, she said. "That is not normal for campaign-grade pieces." She tapped the envelope. Store receipt, date and handoff notes. I also asked market security for aisle camera backup after I got uneasy. They gave me a duplicate under vendor incident policy. My pulse climbed, but my voice held. "Who was the seller listed as?" She handed me the receipt first. V. Cade. Signature abbreviated. Stall rental paid by card ending in 4421. The paper shook once between my fingers before I steadied it against my sleeve. The timestamp was 7/18, 3 days before the memorial dinner. Item count, 12 medallions, 4 bars, assorted ribbons. No provenance attached. On the back of the receipt, Inez had written in block letters, "Seller unloaded green lockbox with unit crest, assisted by mail porter, no manifest." I asked, "May I view the footage here?" She nodded toward a power strip under her table. I knelt on the concrete, inserted the USB into my tablet, and opened a folder labeled ST47_ILCAM_copy. The footage was fixed angle, silent, and harsh under fluorescent light. At 7:11, Vanessa entered frame in a dark coat and gloves, pulling a green lockbox on a luggage cart. She looked smaller on camera than she did at podiums, more hurried, chin forward, scanning for witnesses. A porter helped her lift the box onto the table. She opened it, removed velvet trays, and began arranging medals in rows with the efficiency of someone handling objects she knew by shape. At 7:14, one medal tilted toward the camera as she wiped it with a cloth. For 2 seconds, the rim engraving came into focus. B+/DS-41729. My father's blood type. My father's service number. Verifiable continuity in 12 characters. I paused the frame, enlarged it, and captured stills with timestamp overlay. Inez watched without interrupting. Around us, market noise carried on. Coins counted into palms, a child asking for a lemonade, a radio testing static on another aisle, as if the floor had not just shifted beneath my entire case. I exported duplicate copies to my secure drive and asked Inez if she would provide a written statement. "I already drafted one," she said, and produced a notarized affidavit from the envelope, signed that morning at a bank 2 blocks away. "I am old, Miss Sullivan, not careless." "Why keep this for me?" I asked. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at me. "Because your father once corrected a procurement audit that would have stripped my brother's unit citations for a clerical error. He treated records like lives. I recognized the crest on that box, and I recognized the woman selling from your memorial program photo in the paper." She tapped the affidavit again. "People count on widows and daughters not understanding process. They count on shame doing their work. I do not assist that economy. I paid her for the duplicate media under market policy, so there would be a documented transfer, then asked her to sign a receipt of release with date, time, and device serial number. She signed without comment. I photographed the signed release beside her vendor badge and stall number placard. Physical evidence collected, source documented, transfer logged. When I stood, my knees protested the concrete, and I realized I had been holding my breath through most of the footage. At the market exit, I sat in my car with the envelope on my lap and called my counsel's office from my contact list, leaving a concise message with the new evidence index and request for emergency filing language. Then I sent a copy of the receipt and one still image, only the lockbox and timestamp, not the engraving, to the Foundation Records Administrator with subject line Supplemental Preservation Evidence, and requested immediate hold notice to the auction committee. Within 9 minutes, the administrator replied that the hold request had been forwarded to board counsel for review. Dismissive or cooperative, it no longer mattered. The contact outcome was now in writing. I placed the envelope and USB into the fireproof pouch, sealed it, and wrote one final line in my notebook before starting the engine. "She built her authority on performance. I will answer with continuity." I closed the notebook, pulled out of the fairgrounds lot, and took the service road toward downtown with the envelope sealed beside me like a second pulse. At the first red light, my counsel called back. Martin Hales never wasted words, and that afternoon his restraint sounded tighter than usual. "Do not send additional stills to anyone outside legal channels," he said. "Vanessa's counsel filed an emergency motion this morning. They're alleging reputational harassment and unauthorized surveillance. Hearing request is marked expedited." I kept my eyes on the signal and asked, "Did they acknowledge disputed property status?" He gave a soft exhale that was almost a laugh. "They called your claim sentimental confusion amplified by grief." I wrote the phrase on the legal pad at the wheel. "File our response with the receipt, affidavit, and still image with engraving," I said. "Chain of custody index included." He paused, then answered, "Bring originals to chambers intake before close. We are going to be treated as if we are improvising. We cannot improvise." I made chambers intake with 11 minutes before close. The clerk logged each original receipt, notarized affidavit, USB, print stills against Martin's emergency response and sealed them in an evidence pouch with a barcode I photographed before it disappeared behind restricted glass. Martin filed before cut-off and texted one line. Record now outruns rhetoric. Saturday and Sunday were declarations, cross-references, and service confirmations. I matched timestamps from stall 47 against my Memorial Night log and appended the probate clerk's no authorization note as standing context, then rebuilt the chain of custody index so every handoff sat on one page. Late Sunday, docket control pushed notice. Expedited hearing remained on calendar. In-person originals required at Monday intake. By Monday morning, the probate annex looked like every institutional building that expected people to arrive uncertain. Glass frontage, grey carpet tiles, fluorescent strips humming above directional signage that over-explained simple corridors. I signed in at security, declared digital media at the tray, and watched the guards swab my tablet and USB pouch, while two law firms in tailored navy passed through the express lane reserved for registered counsel. When I reached clerk intake on the third floor, the woman behind the glass scanned my filing packet and lifted her eyes to the line reading Pro C Supplemental Custodian Submission. "You are appearing without representation?" she asked, tone neutral but already sceptical. "Counsel is appearing remotely on the emergency docket," I answered. "I am submitting original evidence for authentication." She tapped the edge of the packet with one fingernail. "This court is not an archive desk, Miss Sullivan. We deal in legal standing." I slid forward the amended inventory page bearing my father's signature and my designation as archival reviewer. "Then please stamp receipt against Standing Exhibit A and tell me if any element is missing." She read longer that time, then stamped the first page and pushed it back without apology. In courtroom B, seating had already been choreographed by habit and perception before the judge entered. Vanessa sat with her attorney at the front right table beneath the county seal, posture composed, black suit immaculate, widow pin centered as if it were an argument. Two foundation trustees occupied the first gallery row behind her, close enough to be seen in photographs, distant enough to deny coordination. I was directed by the bailiff toward the left rear counsel table, usually used for overflow matters and self-represented parties. When I asked for access to the evidence monitor at centre, he looked at my folder and said, "Use the side screen. Primary display is reserved." Reserved for whom was clear without his saying it. Opposing counsel introduced himself as Trent Halvorsen, partner track, estate, and reputational defence. His opening statement framed me as a distressed daughter conducting a campaign against a widow in active mourning. "We do not trivialise loss," he told the court, hands lightly spread, voice rich with controlled sympathy. "But institutions cannot be governed by private fixation." He referred to my preservation notices as digital agitation, my vendor evidence as market gossip, my request for injunction as an attempt to seize narrative control through procedural noise. He did not raise his volume. He did not need to. He had the room's default assumption and spoke directly into it. When it was my turn, the judge looked over his glasses and asked whether I understood the burden required for temporary injunctive relief. "Yes, Your Honour," I said. "Likelihood of prevailing on merits, risk of irreparable harm, and public interest alignment where protected military property is implicated." He nodded once, expression unreadable. I moved to the side screen, inserted the USB and pulled up the receipt first, then the notarized affidavit, then the still showing the rim engraving with timestamp. Halvorsen objected before the image finished loading. "Foundation, authenticity and context," he said. 2 seconds of low-resolution footage does not establish ownership continuity." I answered without turning away from the screen. "The engraving displays blood type and service number matching prior catalogued records and household inventory photographs, all submitted in Exhibit Packets C through F." The judge asked for those pages. The clerk passed them up with the faint hesitation people reserve for material they expect to collapse. The social pressure did not arrive as a single strike. It accumulated in calibrated reductions. Halvorsen referred to me as Ms. Cade's stepdaughter 3 times after being corrected on the record. The clerk announced recess and handed courtesy copies to his table first, then to Vanessa, then to trustees, and only after I asked did she pass my own marked packet across. A local reporter in the gallery, one I recognised from the memorial dinner, typed while glancing between Vanessa's profile and my evidence screen, and I could see which angle would run by evening. At recess, when I stood to refill water, two junior associates moved into the narrow aisle and continued discussing family volatility cases without lowering their voices. Once grief organises itself into paperwork, one said, it starts to mimic litigation competence. The other replied, for a day, maybe. They stepped aside only when the bailiff told them to clear the path. Outside the courtroom, I called Martin from the corridor near the vending machines where the signal held steady. He is building a competency narrative, I said. Not against the facts, against my posture. Martin answered through speaker static, then give him less posture to mischaracterize and more record to trip over. Asked the court to compel disclosure of sale proceeds and stall rental payment instruments. He won't want discovery at this stage. I returned to the room and did exactly that. Halverson objected again, framing the request as harassment. The judge denied immediate discovery but ordered both parties to preserve all transaction records pending further hearing. It was not the order I needed. It was a door left open in writing. Vanessa spoke only once, at her counsel's prompting, and chose the line she had been polishing for days. I have protected Colonel Sullivan's legacy from unmanaged handling, she said. I am being punished for maintaining standards. She never looked at me while she spoke. She looked at the judge, then briefly at the trustees, then at the reporter. Audience first, always. When the judge asked whether any medals had been sold, she answered, not to my knowledge as framed by these allegations. The wording was precise enough to evade a direct contradiction, and vague enough to preserve manoeuvring room. I wrote it down exactly and underlined as framed. The hearing ended with a partial ruling that tightened the pressure around me rather than relieving it. No immediate injunction. No transfer of custodial authority. The judge set a rapid continuation date and ordered both sides to submit sworn declarations within 48 hours. As the room emptied, Halverson gathered his binders with the smooth confidence of someone who considered delay its own victory. Passing my table, he offered a professional half-smile. Ms. Sullivan, courts prefer verified chains over emotional certainty. I met his gaze and answered, so do I. He inclined his head and moved on. In the lobby, the exclusion became public before I reached the stairs. My phone lit with a foundation bulletin distributed to board members, donors and media contacts. Subject line, clarification on stewardship integrity. The statement did not name me, but it described an individual family affiliate advancing unverified claims and confirmed that the Veterans Legacy auction would proceed under Vanessa Cade's stewardship without disruption. At the bottom, my previously issued all-access event credential was marked suspended pending review. I stood under the atrium skylight reading it twice while people flowed around me with courthouse folders tucked under their arms. The pressure Vanessa wanted was now institutional, printed and already circulating. I moved to a bench by the west entrance and began response protocol before the first wave of reaction calls could frame me into defence. I forwarded the bulletin to Martin with subject line, retaliatory narrative artifact, attached to declaration. I sent a concise notice to the Foundation Records Administrator citing the court's preservation order and requesting written confirmation that no disputed memorabilia would be transferred, sold or displayed without judicial clearance. I copied board counsel. Then I called the Memorial Hall Facilities Sergeant who had made the event log entry and asked whether his notation remained intact after archive migration. He checked while I waited, then confirmed the entry was still present and time-stamped. I logged his confirmation and thanked him by name. The courthouse doors opened behind me with a hydraulic sigh, and footsteps approached with measured cadence rather than hurry. "Ms. Sullivan," a man asked. The voice carried command without performance. I stood and turned. He was in his late 60s, broad-shouldered despite age, grey hair cut close, civilian charcoal coat over a regimental tie, with a small procurement insignia pin at the knot. His posture had the unmistakable economy of long service. "I am retired Colonel Elias Mercer," he said. "Former Procurement Command, Eastern Theatre Rotation. I requested to speak with you before leaving county limits." I had heard his name since I was a cadet volunteer at logistics symposiums. His audit reforms were still cited in training modules. "Colonel Mercer," I said, and he gave a slight nod at the title, acknowledgement rather than vanity. He held a leather document tube in one hand and a folded market map in the other. I saw the foundation bulletin this morning and recognised a phrase attached to your father's campaign set that should never have appeared in public inventory language, he said. I drove to the fairgrounds yesterday and confirmed stall 47 transaction logs. Then I came to observe this hearing. He looked past me through the glass toward the courtroom corridor where Vanessa and Halverson were still speaking with the reporter. Your opposition is counting on delay and embarrassment. That strategy fails when provenance is purchased, secured, and documented by someone they cannot recast as family turbulence. The sentence took a second to settle. Purchased? I asked. He unrolled the market map on the bench between us and placed his finger on a red square labelled 47. I bought every medal sold at that stall on the morning of transfer, he said. 12 medallions, 4 bars, associated ribbons, all from a green lockbox with Sullivan unit insignia. He opened the document tube and removed a packet clipped in military order, itemised receipts, payment records, chain of possession memo, and a notarised affidavit bearing his signature and seal date. I suspected unlawful disposition at the point of sale. I purchased to prevent dispersal while I verified source. Items are secured in archival wrapping at my attorney's vault pending court direction. He met my eyes directly. I did not contact the Foundation first because I needed the custody path unpolluted. For the first time since the medals vanished, the room inside my chest that had been braced for impact altered shape. Not relief yet, not victory, structural possibility. Will you testify? I asked. His answer was immediate. Under oath, with records. He tapped the top receipt. I also retained the stall camera duplicate before overwrite cycle and had the footage hash certified this morning. Your 2-second engraving frame is valid. My copy extends from unloading through transaction close. No gaps. He paused, then added in a quieter register, your father once refused a ceremonial shortcut that would have concealed a procurement error tied to my office. He chose record integrity over convenience. I am returning that discipline. Behind us, the reporter emerged into the lobby and stopped when she recognized Mercer. Her expression shifted from routine attention to alert calculation. He turned toward her before she could speak and said evenly, "If you print on stewardship today, include this. Contested military artifacts were removed from open market circulation by me under documented suspicion of unauthorized sale. I will file affidavit with the court by 1700. She opened her notebook without argument. I asked Mercer whether he needed escort access for filing. Already arranged, he said. Clark's supervisor cleared direct intake when I presented credentials. He folded the map back into precise quarters and handed me a business card with 2 numbers on the back. Use the second line for counsel only. First line is screened. Then he gave the briefest version of rank recognition, the kind that carries both respect and instruction. Miss Sullivan, hold your line. Do not chase their theatre. Build your docket. Vanessa exited the corridor at that moment with Halverson half a step ahead of her, still speaking. She saw me standing beside Mercer, or saw the document tube, saw the reporter pivoting toward us, and stopped so abruptly that one trustee behind her nearly collided with her shoulder. Mercer turned, straightened to full height, and inclined his head with formal civility that left no room for familiarity. Ms. Cade, he said, you should inform counsel I will be submitting sworn materials on stall 47. Her face did not contort. She had too much practice for that. But colour drained from it in a clean, visible line, and her hand tightened around her folder until the top sheet bent. No one raised a voice. No one needed to. The axis of credibility had shifted in a courthouse lobby under neutral light in front of a clerk, a reporter, and the people who had spent weeks treating me as a grieving amateur with a stack of feelings. Mercer gave me one final nod and headed toward intake with the steady pace of a man who understood the value of minutes in contested record windows. I watched him cross the tile, document tube under his arm like a standard carried without ceremony, and for the first time in months I felt the pressure in my chest align with direction instead of containment. The narrative Vanessa had built on posture and access had encountered a witness immune to both. I picked up my folder, called Martin and said, "We have our authority witness. Prepare the amended declaration now. Martin answered on the first ring, and I could hear keyboard clicks behind his voice before I finished the sentence. We have our authority witness. Prepare the amended declaration now. I already opened it, he said. Do not leave the courthouse yet. Go to conference room 3B, West Corridor. Mercer's affidavit needs your exhibit cross-index in person if we want admission tonight. Tonight? I asked. They advanced the continuation hearing to emergency session tied to the Veterans Legacy auction. If the property is in circulation, the court will not wait for next week. He paused long enough for me to hear the weight of the next instruction. Taylor, this is the hinge. Stay procedural. I crossed the lobby with my folder against my ribs and took the west corridor past framed county portraits and a water fountain that rattled every 7 seconds. In 3B, Martin appeared on the wall monitor from his office, tie loosened, reading glasses low, 3 document windows open behind him. Mercer arrived 2 minutes later with his document tube and placed it on the table with the care of someone setting down ordnance. We worked without ceremony. I read item numbers while Martin updated the declaration in real time. Stall 47 receipts, notarized affidavit, payment instrument copy, stall map, footage hash certification, custody memo from Mercer's attorney vault, my original Memorial Night photographs, facilities log entry at 2140, stripped placard screw image, tape residue image, probate clerk procedural note. Each artifact found its place in a chain that no longer depended on my credibility alone. At 15:18, the clerk supervisor came in with a portable scanner, verified originals against copies, and sealed a fresh evidence pouch with a new barcode. Judge Renwick has authorized same-day evidentiary continuation at the Regimental Hall Annex, she said. Session opens before auction call. All disputed stewardship statements are subject to correction order if ruled. She looks at me then, not with sympathy this time, but with administrative respect. Be there by 1800 for oath intake. By 16:05, while we were still signing the last declaration page, my phone lit with a response from the Foundation Records administrator I had contacted on the courthouse bench. It was brief and defensive. The auction proceeds as scheduled under current board authority unless and until a court order directs otherwise. I forwarded it to Martin. He replied in 10 seconds. Good. Retaliatory posture preserved in writing. The regimental hall looked unchanged when I arrived at 1741, and that was the point. Polished brass rails, waxed floors, lilies near the honour table, trustees clustered in controlled conversation beneath campaign photos, all the old choreography intact and waiting for one more performance. The difference was invisible to anyone glancing in from the doors. A court seal now hung on a movable stand near the dais. 2 deputy clerks sat at a side table with oath ledgers open, and a court reporter tested her machine beside the auction lectern. Public ritual had been converted into legal theatre with a judge at centre. Vanessa stood in the front row reserved for foundation principles. Black suit pressed to a sharp line, widow pin exactly aligned. Halverson at her shoulder with a binder tabbed in red. She saw me enter with Mercer and Martin's associate, and for a second her gaze snagged on the evidence cases in our hands, before she reset her expression into neutral concern. One trustee leaned toward her and whispered. She answered without turning her head. I could not hear the words, but I recognized the mechanism. Maintain audience calm, suggest control, deny velocity. At 18:02, the bailiff called session. Judge Renwick took the centre chair on the dais where the auctioneer would have stood, and the room rose in one synchronized motion that sounded like fabric and chair legs rather than respect. When we sat, the judge addressed the room first, not counsel. This is a continuation of the emergency probate matter concerning disputed military memorabilia and custodial authority, because the Veterans Legacy auction is scheduled in this venue and because contested items were reported to have entered commercial circulation, the court is taking evidence in public view to prevent further transfer and to preserve institutional record integrity. He turned to the clerks. Mark all audio as on record. Halverson opened with objection architecture, the same polished framework he had used in courtroom B. Your Honour, we renew challenge on foundation, chain continuity and prejudicial staging. Judge Renwick cut him off with a glance. You may challenge each exhibit after admission argument. You may not describe this as staging while your client planned to proceed with an auction under disputed stewardship. A low murmur moved through the second row where donors sat. Halverson sat down. Mercer took oath first. He did not dramatize a single word. Under direct questioning from Martin's associate, he identified his procurement command history, credential record, and familiarity with Colonel Daniel Sullivan's campaign set from prior official inventory review. Then he placed a flat archival case on the evidence table, opened it, and turned it toward the judge. Metal caught light in ordered rows, no flourish, only restored sequence. "I purchased every medal from stall 47 to prevent dispersal," he said, voice level enough to carry to the back wall, "because I recognized Colonel Sullivan's campaign set and suspected unlawful transfer." He handed up receipts in numerical order, then the stall map, then his notarized affidavit. Items remained sealed in my attorney's vault pending court direction. No resale, no display, no alteration. The judge reviewed the receipts one by one, asking short verification questions. Payment method, date, market policy, witness signatures. Mercer answered with exact times. The court reporter's keys moved in clean bursts. When Halverson rose to cross, he aimed for motive. "Colonel Mercer, you inserted yourself into a private family dispute. Is it fair to say personal loyalty coloured your judgment?" Mercer looked at him as if the question were a training prompt. "It is fair to say procurement discipline informed my judgment. Unprovenance sale of campaign-grade medals with identifiable service engravings is a red flag regardless of family context." He paused. "Loyalty did not buy those items. Receipts did." I was sworn next. Martin's associate walked me through exhibit continuity. My memorial night photographs with clock and date card, the facilities log entry at 2140, the stripped placard screw and tape residue at the display base, the vendor receipt naming VCADE, the USB footage still showing rim engraving BPOS/DS-41729, comparative catalogue page from my father's signed inventory amendment. I kept my voice formal, sentence lengths controlled, no speculation beyond what each image could sustain. "I am not asking the court to infer intent from grief," I said. "I am asking the court to follow documented movement from household display to commercial sale and back to secured recovery." Halverson cross-examined with the same condescension he had refined all week, but his tone had changed at the edges, thinner and less patient. "Ms. Sullivan, you have been emotionally invested in these items for years, correct?" he said. "Yes." "And emotional investment can affect perception. So can financial and reputational investment," I answered, "which is why I filed timestamps instead of accusations." The judge intervened before Halverson could redirect. "Counsel, move to material contradiction if you have one." He did not. Vanessa requested to testify. Under oath, she repeated her earlier line with minor revisions. She'd protected legacy, delegated handling, lacked knowledge of any unlawful sale as framed by allegations. Martin's associate placed the foundation bulletin on the screen, the one sent from her authority channel after the court preservation order. Then she placed the market receipt with VCADE's signature, then a freeze frame from Mercer's footage showing Vanessa at stall 47 opening the green lockbox. "Miss Cade, is this you?" she asked. Vanessa looked at the screen and said, "The image quality is poor. Is it you? It resembles me." The associate advanced 2 frames to the medal rim engraving and then to a still where Vanessa's bracelet, a diamond line bracelet with 3 distinct square links, caught the fluorescent light, the same bracelet she wore on the memorial dais. "Is this your bracelet?" Vanessa's throat moved once before sound came. "I own similar jewellery." Judge Renwick leaned forward. "Ms. Cade, this court requires direct answers. Did you bring Colonel Sullivan's medals to stall 47 for sale?" Silence stretched across the hall and turned the room from social space into evidence chamber. Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it, then said, "I transferred items for temporary evaluation." Mercer spoke once from the witness row, with permission. "No evaluator buys in cash at flea market rates." No one laughed. The sentence landed and stayed. At 1906, Judge Renwick ruled from the bench. He admitted Mercer's evidence in full, found credible continuity between the Sullivan household display and Stall 47 sale, and held that Vanessa's transfer constituted unlawful disposition of protected military property within active probate control. He ordered immediate restitution of all recovered medals to me as designated custodian under amended estate authority, effective upon clerk entry that night. He imposed financial penalties against Vanessa for fraudulent disposition and directed board counsel to file corrected Memorial Foundation records within 48 hours, including removal of sole stewardship claims and reissuance of all public bulletins that had described my filings as unverified harassment. He also ordered temporary injunction against any auction listing tied to Sullivan artifacts pending final inventory review. Then he turned to the hall announcer, waiting by the lectern with the auction script still in hand. "Read a correction now," he said. The announcer swallowed, adjusted the microphone and read from the text the clerk passed him. "By order of the probate court, prior statements naming Vanessa Cade as sole steward of Colonel Daniel Sullivan's medals are withdrawn. Custodial authority is reassigned to Taylor Sullivan pending trust formalization and corrected record filing." It was concise. It was public. It was enough. The visible destabilization began at the front row before the microphone cut off. Vanessa's face lost color so quickly that her makeup no longer blended at the jawline. She lifted a hand toward the podium edge as if to object, but her fingers shook against the wood, and the first word stalled in her throat. Halverson leaned in, spoke low, and she did not answer. When she tried again, only a dry breath came out, not language, and she sat down because standing had become uncertain. The two trustees behind her did not touch her shoulder or offer the usual performative support. They shifted their chairs back, gathered their folders, and stepped into the aisle with the careful distance people create when affiliation turns from asset to risk. Around the room, silence changed character. It was no longer the silence of people waiting for her cue. It was the silence of witnesses recalculating what they had endorsed. The reporter from the courthouse bench rewrote her lead paragraph in plain view, crossed out stewardship, underlined unlawful disposition. The donor couple who had avoided my table at the memorial dinner kept their eyes on the floor. The junior associates who had mocked paperwork in the courthouse aisle stood near the rear doors, suddenly preoccupied with their phones. Even the foundation administrator, who had emailed me defiance at 16:05, remained seated with both hands flat on her legal pad, looking at the correction script as if it might change shape. Judge Renwick gave final directives and rose. The clerks moved immediately, collecting signed orders, marking exhibits, issuing certified copies in a line that formed before anyone thought to speak. I stood at the evidence table while deputy clerks transferred Mercer's recovered medals to my custodial receipt, each item checked against inventory numbers and sealed in archival sleeves for transport. Physical evidence collected, submitted, analysed and returned under order. Thread by thread, the record closed around the truth Vanessa had treated as optional. As I signed the last receipt, I looked once toward the front row. Vanessa sat rigid, eyes fixed on a point above the judge's empty chair, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. No one occupied the seats beside her now. Her power had depended on uncontested narrative, and in less than an hour that narrative had been replaced by documentation read aloud under oath in the very hall where she had once asked the room to trust her tone over my record. I did not walk to her. I did not speak to her. I lifted the sealed case, acknowledged Mercer with a single nod, and turned toward the clerk's table to file the corrected custody entry before the ink on the order had time to dry. I turned toward the clerk's table to file the corrected custody entry before the ink on the order had time to dry, and the deputy clerk met me with a new ledger already open, her finger on the signature line. Receipt of restored property, temporary sole custodial authority, pending trust formalization, she said, reading exactly from the page so no word could drift later. I set the sealed archival case down, showed my identification, and signed. She countersigned, then applied a dated seal that bit into the paper with a hard metallic click. "Item verification inside room," she said. "You and Colonel Mercer only." The side room had cinder block walls, a steel table, and fluorescent light that removed all ceremony from the evening. Mercer stood across from me as the deputy clerk broke the seal and laid the medals out on clean blotter paper one by one, matching each against the court inventory sheet. Silver Star. Campaign set. unit commendations, service bars, associated ribbons. She called out numbers. I confirmed condition. Mercer confirmed purchase sequence. When she reached the medal with the rim engraving, she angled it to the light and read BPOS DS-41729. Then she looked up and marked identity continuity confirmed. "Any objection to immediate resealing for transport?" she asked. "None," Mercer said. "None," I said. She resealed the set in archival sleeves and initialed across the evidence tape with me and Mercer beside her initials, 3 names crossing one seam. Physical evidence collected, transferred, challenged, authenticated, and returned under order. Nothing left floating. When we stepped back into the hall, the crowd had thinned to those who needed paperwork and those who still hoped posture might reverse what record had done. Vanessa remained in the front row, still rigid, still facing forward. Halverson was on his phone near the side aisle, speaking in low bursts, no longer performing confidence for an audience. He looked at me once, then away. The loaded half-smile he had offered in the courthouse never returned. At the Clark station, the Foundation Records Administrator stood with a printed correction notice in hand, waiting for certification. She was the same person who had emailed me at 16:05 that the auction would proceed unless a court order directed otherwise. Now she slid the page across to the clerk and said, "Please timestamp filing and provide certified copy for distribution list." Her voice was steady, but her thumb pressed the paper hard enough to crease it. She did not apologize. She complied. Outcome recorded. The announcer, who had read Vanessa's stewardship lines at the memorial dinner and then read the court correction tonight, approached with his script folder tucked under his arm. "Ms. Sullivan," he said, careful, formal, "the revised statement will run at opening of tomorrow's scholarship luncheon as directed. I wanted you to hear that from me directly." I held his gaze and nodded once. "Thank you for stating it on record." He seemed to consider saying more, then only inclined his head and stepped back. Some people reveal what they knew, others reveal what they will obey. Near the rear doors, the volunteer coordinator who had redirected me to the support row at the memorial dinner waited until I had a clear path and then spoke in a quiet voice. "I filed a witness note with board counsel tonight," she said, "about seating instructions that were not routine." She swallowed. "I should have done it earlier." This time I did not soften the truth for her. Earlier would have mattered. Tonight still counts. She nodded, eyes damp but composed, and handed me a copy-stamped statement with her signature at the bottom. One more thread closed. By 21:30, the hall had emptied enough that I could hear the HVAC cycling above the flags. The facility sergeant from Memorial Night arrived with his logbook under one arm. "Ma'am, Clark requested original event log page for attachment," he said. He opened to the 2140 entry, my requested condition notation exactly where he had written it, initials intact. On the opposite page he had added tonight's line, "Court-ordered restitution completed, display table C under revised custodial authority." I thanked him by name. "You kept the record clean," he answered. "You asked for neutral documentation. It mattered." Before I left, maintenance brought the placard bracket from my father's display case in a labelled evidence bag. The right screw head was stripped bright against older patina, just as I had photographed. The maintenance lead said, "Removed in haste with wrong bit size." We checked residue under the base too, packing tape adhesive, recent, non-archival. He pointed to his report. Submitted to Clark as corroborative physical detail. Distinctive details accounted for, not dismissed as anxiety. 3 days later, under a hammered steel morning sky, I sat in my father's study with archival cloth laid flat across the table and the sealed case open in front of me. The room smelled of old paper and cedar, the same scent that had steadied me when he taught me to inventory by touch before sight. I wore cotton gloves, lifted each medal from its sleeve, checked edge, face, pinback, and engraving against the amended inventory list, then nested it into its velvet recess. Metal met fabric with a soft, final sound. Not dramatic, exact. On the third placement, my phone vibrated with a call from the probate clerk whose extension I had logged after the first week. "Ms. Sullivan, certified amended authority has been entered," she said. "You are now listed as designated custodian and interim curator pending trust vote. Also for your record, no appeal stay was granted this morning." I thanked her, asked permission to note her confirmation, and wrote the time in my log margin. External contact resolved. An hour later, Martin called. Local paper issued correction and retraction, he said. Headline now states unlawful sale confirmed. Restitution ordered. Your filings are described as documented claims, not harassment. He paused. Halverson withdrew reputational motion with prejudice. It cannot be refiled on the same facts. I set the pen down and let that land in silence before answering. Send me the withdrawal order for archive. He did. By the second week of the month, the Foundation Board convened an extraordinary records session in the same conference room where I had once been removed from speaker lists. Glass walls, polished table, regimental crest at the far end. Trustees sat in assigned seats with correction packets stacked at each place. No one used the phrase family support row anymore. Board counsel read the mandatory actions into the minutes. Sole stewardship claim removed. All Sullivan archive captions reverted to verified metadata. Memorial Night bulletin corrected. Suspended credential restored with full access. Auction ledger amended to show items withdrawn by court order before sale. Then the chair turned to me. Ms. Sullivan, the Trust requires a curator with custodial competence and institutional fluency. Will you accept appointment as curator of the Regimental Remembrance Trust, effective immediately? Yes, I said. No applause followed, and I was grateful for that. This was governance, not theatre. One trustee who had once stood behind Vanessa at centre table cleared his throat and said, For the minutes, I relied on representations that were false. I should have asked for records sooner. He looked at me directly. That failure is mine. Another trustee stared at his folder and said nothing. The captain, who had nodded politely and then angled toward Vanessa at the first dinner, never contacted me, never filed a statement, and never appeared at another hearing. I noted his absence privately and moved on. Not every look receives a confession. When the meeting adjourned, the records administrator handed me a drive containing the corrected archive, including the old photograph where my shoulder had been cropped into irrelevance. The caption now read, Colonel Daniel Sullivan, presenting logistics insignia to Lieutenant Taylor Sullivan. Family and command ceremony. A small correction on a public page. A large correction in the architecture of memory. That evening, I returned to the regimental hall after hours with 2 archivists and the facilities sergeant as witness. We reopened display table C. Under new glass and proper mounts, we placed my father's medals in full sequence with chain of custody card visible at the corner. The right placard screw had been replaced and logged with maintenance date. The tape residue under the base had been cleaned with conservation solvent and documented in the exhibit report. No hidden adjustments, no private edits. I stood back while the sergeant locked the case and handed me the key receipt. Custodian copy, he said. Thank you. When the others left, I remained alone for a minute in the quiet hall, the brass rails catching the last of the overhead light. I could still map the old choreography in the room. Centre and edge, named and omitted, praised and managed. The geometry had not vanished. It had been rewritten by record. I placed my hand lightly on the case, not to claim possession, but to acknowledge completion. My name was Taylor Sullivan. I had not won because I spoke louder. I had won because I stopped confusing endurance with surrender, assembled proof when I was dismissed, and brought that proof into institutions built to verify what performance tries to erase. Silence was never peace. It was surrender. I was done surrendering.